Okay, so at this point, we have allowed the user to successfully log in, and now they're looking at the main activity. And so we've used parse to be able to authenticate the user with the user that's already in our database. And now we're in the main screen of our application, where we want to be able to allow them to compose a brand new post that we'll put in Instagram, in our version of Instagram. Okay, so first thing we need to do is build the UI to allow the user to create a post. And similar to the login screen, I've gone ahead and done this for us just to speed things up a little bit. Let me show you what I've done. It's basically after you log in, you see this screen. There's a edit text at the top, a button. Here, this blank space is where we're going to have the image, which we're going to show once we take a picture. And then submit. Once this works, this should be the actual button which the user taps in order to submit the request to publish the post. So nothing actually works right now. So if I go into, if I go into here, main activity, you can see all I've done is gotten references to each of the UI elements. And then if I go into the actual XML, like the backing view, you can see that it's a linear layout, very simple. And there's edit text at the top, and there's a button followed by an image, and I've hard-coded this to be 200 dp, 200 pixels, or density independent pixels, and then a submit button at the bottom. That's all that's happening. So what I want to do next is actually, before we actually do anything with hooking up buttons, we need to have a concept of what is a post, right? So we've defined this new entity called a post in our parse dashboard, right? But our application doesn't really know anything about that. And so we need to, that's going to be our first step. So why don't we create a brand new class and call this post. And an example to see how to do this, if you go back to the Codepath guide for installing the Parse SDK, and you go into the section about working with data objects. So it talks about, in this article, storing data on parse is built around the parse object, right? So here's an example of a custom item. They have something called to-do item, which extends the parse object. So we'll have something very similar, except we'll have it be called post, and it'll extend parse object. So we'll do extends parse object, and then what you want to do is say parse class name here, and do post, and then you have basically getters and setters for each attribute of that item. So this is actually very similar to the idea of the model. Remember how we had a tweet model or a user model in Twitter? We're doing something quite similar here, except we're leveraging all of the power of parse, so it becomes quite a bit simpler. And so what we're going to do is actually reference the keys of our post. So the custom keys that we defined are description, image, and user. So I'm going to create basically 3 keys, and the key that these are all going to be strings, and they're all going to match exactly with the column name that we defined here. Description, and then we'll have one which is called key image, and then one more which is called key user. And so then, if we go back to the guide, you can see how it says we have getters and setters. And so, for example, description is easy. If we say public string, it's going to give us back a string. We'll say get description. And we'll say get key description. Okay, so actually this method getString is actually defined on the parse object. And so all we're doing is we're saying, okay, get this string which has this associated key, and the key is the column name. So when we call this method getDescription, we're saying on the underlying post object, give us back the description. We're going to do similarly for the setter method. So public void set description. And we'll do set we'll do put key description, that's the key name, and then the value is going to be a string that the user passes in, that we pass in. Okay, and then let's just do something similar for the image and the user. So with the image, there's actually a special kind of object called the parse file. And so when we request the image, we're going to get back a parse file. And from there, that's how we're going to be able to display the image. Image. So you can see how essentially all we're doing is we're forwarding these requests down to the underlying parse object with these special keys. Public. And then again, for parse user, for the user that made the post, we're going to be referencing a special class called the parse user class. We'll say get user. The key user and user. Great, okay, so that's all we need to do here. One thing to keep in mind, and just if you go back to the guide, it'll talk about this, we need to make sure to register the class with parse before we call parse.initialize. So if we go back to our parse application, before this call to initialize, we need to actually do parse object register subclass. And here we actually reference the class. Okay, so let's just run it, and we don't actually expect to see any change in the app because we haven't actually done anything yet, but it should run properly and we should see the UI, the UI that I already built. Okay, and then like usual, like we expect, nothing happens if you tap the button. One thing we can try out right here is actually querying for the posts. So now that we have the post model defined, one natural thing we might want to do is actually be able to query for all the post models. So let's do an example of that. So let's say query posts. And the way we'll do that is if you go back to the guide, then scroll down a little bit here, and you can, there's a section about querying objects. And so we're going to do something quite similar to that. We'll say parse query, and we'll parameterize this parse query by the object that we're trying to query on, which is the post. Query new. And pass in the post.class. Great. And now what we do is we actually just say post query.find in background find callback. And so the reason you have two options when you do the query. One is find, and then the other is find in background. And the reason find in background is preferable is because you don't want to do expensive operations on the UI thread or the main thread. And by default, this is actually going to be running on the main thread. And so as much as possible for expensive operations, such as this one, because this is expensive because it's actually making a network call, right? For expensive operations such as that, you want to do this in the background. And so once this call succeeds, we get into this callback. And here we have the list of post objects. So I'm just going to call this posts. And here we can actually start to log the information. Say log.d, and then give it the tag, which I've defined up here, just be main activity. And we can say post. So let's do a for loop. across all of the posts. Right, and so this get description method is calling the method that we wrote, which will query for the attribute which has this key description, right? And so when we run this, what we expect to see is a single line in the logs, which will be the post, which has the post, which is here, which is I love pandas as a description. So let's see if that actually happens. We've run it, it looks like. If we go into logcat, go all the way down, you do see, yeah, okay, we have a post and it has I love pandas. So that's how we can get that to work. One thing, however, is that in addition to the post, we also want to get the corresponding user who has made that post. And by default, we won't actually get the full details of the user. In order to get that to work, you actually need to specify that in the query. So you need to say post query.include, and you need to specify the key, right? And the key will be this string user, okay? And we've actually defined that already in the post.java class, and it's going to be the key user. So we'll say post.key user. So now when we get the details of the post back, we will get the full details of the user as well. And one way to kind of prove that is we can say, add something else to the log saying, and username is post get I get user, and then get username. Just to make this a little bit cleaner, why don't we do this? So I save this into a local variable. We have the post that we're looking at. We're printing out the description along with the username of the person who made that post. Let's see if this works. Okay, so now you can see as a post, I love pandas, and the username is Rahul as expected. So if we did not do the include, this would actually not give us back Rahul as the username. I think it would just be empty. So the way you can think about this is that it's similar to in previous assignments how we had a call with async HTTP, and we would say make a network call and we would get JSON objects back. So this is quite similar to what we're doing there, except instead of getting JSON objects back, parse takes care of a lot of the complexity and parsing for us, and it gives us back a list of the models that we care about. And one thing we should do here is, again, check if there is a parse exception, and if there is, then we shouldn't really be parsing any of the data. So if the parse exception is not null, then we should print something out and say, you know, there's an error with query, and then print out the stack trace, and then return. So we never actually go into the for loop.